Bonjour à toutes et à tous. My 2017 Environmental Protection Report, Good Choices, Bad Choices, Environmental Rights and Environmental Protection in Ontario, highlights some recent environmental successes and failures. I'm going to point out three of them. The first, one of the most shameful, is the unjust pollution affecting Indigenous peoples. Both governments and business have long turned a blind eye to pollution of Indigenous communities. For example, for over 60 years, and we have an illustration over here, the Grassy Narrows and Wabaseemoong First Nation communities northwest of Dryden have suffered the devastating effects of mercury poisoning. In the most recent study, over 58% of Grassy Narrows and Wabaseemoong residents examined were diagnosed with or suspected of having Minamata disease. Minamata disease is a serious neurological syndrome caused by mercury poisoning. Mercury poisoning damages cognitive abilities and can cause tunnel vision, deafness, numbness, shaking, difficulty walking, even death. Numerous other First Nation reserve communities lack safe drinking water. At the ECO's last count, 36 First Nation communities in Ontario are affected by a drinking water advisory that has been in effect for more than a year. And of those, 17 communities have been affected for more than 10 years. The federal government has the primary responsibility for water infrastructure and regulation for First Nations reserve communities. But the Government of Ontario can and should help by protecting their water sources and by providing more technical expertise and training. The Aamjiwnaang First Nation, located in Sarnia and surrounded by heavy industry, suffers some of the worst air pollution in the country. Altogether, the industrial facilities of Chemical Valley release millions of kilograms of pollution into the Aamjiwnaang and Sarnia airshed every year. There is strong evidence that this pollution is causing profound health problems. Aamjiwnaang is well known for a 2005 study that confirmed a skewed sex ratio of babies. 2 girls are born for every boy. Other studies have found higher than average hospital admissions for respiratory and cardiovascular illnesses, higher than average incidence of some cancers. In Aamjiwnaang, a shelter-in-place siren may go off at any time because of dangerous pollution when the air is not safe to breathe. Residents must immediately go or stay inside, seal their air intakes, and await further instructions. And even these warnings have proved unreliable. Such conditions would not be tolerated elsewhere in Ontario, yet they have long been deemed unworthy of priority, effort, or expense. After decades of neglect, the province is finally taking some steps, but the pollution that these communities face is still outrageous. The Ontario government must make environmental justice part of its pursuit of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And I want to acknowledge the presence of a delegation from Aamjiwnaang today, including Chief Rogers, who are here to speak for themselves. Second, in a clear example of good choices, bad choices, the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change and the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry each simplified their permitting processes, but with very different outcomes. Each ministry shifted some activities from individualized permits to standard rules. And in principle, a well-designed, simplified approval process can save both businesses and government time and money while raising the bar of environmental protection. In practice, the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change took a thoughtful and effective approach. It simplified approvals process for some activities that it regulates under the Environmental Protection Act and the Ontario Water Resources Act has so far been a success. The ministry has brought many previously unregulated facilities under consistent, up-to-date environmental standards while also improving compliance with the law. The ministry also operates a website called Access Environment that lets the public see what approvals a company in their neighborhood has. In stark contrast, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry's permitting system under the Endangered Species Act is a failure. Of the nearly 3,000 requests to harm a species or its habitat since the Act passed a decade ago, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry has never, not once, said no. And instead of the individual permits that by law are supposed to require an overall benefit for species that are endangered or threatened, the MNRF simplified system generally only asks proponents to minimize harm. And to make matters worse, the ministry then turns a blind eye as to whether proponents are complying with even those limited rules. And meanwhile, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry keeps the public in the dark. They don't tell what activities the ministry has allowed to harm species at risk, or by whom, or where, and they do not report on the cumulative effect of those harms on the species. The Algonquin wolf is another example of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry utterly failing to protect species at risk. Algonquin wolves are a unique, threatened, keystone species. They live only in central Ontario and southern Quebec. The Endangered Species Act specifically prohibits killing a threatened species. But the ministry has stripped the Algonquin wolf of much of this protection. There may be as few as 250 mature Algonquin wolves left in the wild in the entire world. And hunting and trapping, allowed by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, are central threats to their survival. Earlier this year, the ministry made much of its good choice to ban the hunting and trapping of a less imperiled species, the snapping turtle. They should do the same, at least for the more threatened Algonquin wolf, which stands little chance of recovery without protection. Third, we are fortunate in our province, very blessed indeed, to have an abundance of water. But our lakes are in trouble. Toxic algae blooms are becoming more frequent, more widespread. Thick scums of algae can make lakes dangerous for swimming, for drinking, for fishing, and can impose serious costs on communities. Algae problems are spreading across Ontario. They affect not only Lake Erie, but also parts of Lake Ontario, Lake Huron, and smaller lakes, especially on the Canadian Shield. A key trigger for algae blooms is the nutrient phosphorus, typically from fertilizer and human and animal excrement. Controlling phosphorus in sewage was the key to cleaning up Lake Erie in the 1970s. Today, phosphorus-contaminated water from farms, streets, and lawns is the main cause of algae blooms. The Ontario government has been relying almost exclusively on voluntary and unevaluated programs to control phosphorus from these non-point sources, and these programs do not do nearly enough. The Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs and the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change need to get serious. They need to use their financial, regulatory, and land use planning powers to slash non-point sources of phosphorus. For example, the government should support farmers who deliver real, verified reductions in phosphorus runoff. They must ban the spreading of phosphorus sources such as manure, fertilizer, and sewage sludge on frozen and saturated ground. And finally, last year, we called on all ministries to show more respect for the public and to improve their compliance with the Environmental Bill of Rights. I am glad to report that at our urging and with our help, ministries made real progress since last year. For example, ministries are giving the public more current and usable information about environmentally significant decisions. The Environmental Bill of Rights is everyone's tool, but the government must give it the attention and respect it deserves. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Commissioner, thanks for your report. When you speak about the Yamshang First Nation, which we in concert with the STAR have been focusing on for quite some time, and with respect to the people that are here from the First Nation today, what is the first area of the priority that you believe the government and concerned parties need to be focusing on?
It is wonderful that the government's going to go ahead and do a health study, but what they really need to do is clean up the air. The levels of benzene and other carcinogens in Sarnia, they're down more than 3/4 over 20 years ago, but they're still much too high. But sulfur dioxide, the ministry has not updated its standard since 1974. And we know that the standard is much too high to protect human health. We know that they don't apply the standard to flares from most of the facilities, and we know that the ministry doesn't take account of cumulative effects. And so the result is that even the much too lax standard isn't applied to what the people are really breathing.
How about the standards that have come into place for benzene? There's been some concern from internal engineers within the Ministry of the Environment that the government doesn't even have the capability to enforce those technical standards.
Well, we made a recommendation about that, and particularly to make sure that the ministry has the technical resources and the staff and the training to properly enforce the benzene standard. Ministry advises us that they are buying additional equipment and that they are providing the additional training to the staff, and somewhere in here is our recommendation. Okay, so we have specifically recommended that they increase the capacity in the Sarnia District Office. We understand that they are going to do so. We've also recommended that the ministry work with the community to find a way to improve transparency and trust. One of the concerns that we kept hearing from the community is that they don't know what's happening. You know, we had that example in February where the siren went off and then stopped. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean they have to run and take the children out from the playground or not? So there needs to be a much better communication. And one of the things the ministry has told us is there is going to be a real-time website made available with all current air quality data. They said later this year, and we're waiting.
But does that fall onto the ministry to notify the public, or is that the city's responsibility?
One of the challenges with reserve communities is because they are primarily federally regulated, all the questions of who is in charge of what get messy. I don't care. The community has to know, and the Ministry of Environment has the ability to make that information available, and they say they're going to do it.
Commissioner, why are these problems being ignored? You say that, you know, effectively this treatment would not be tolerated in other parts of the province, so why is it being tolerated now?
I can't tell you why the government does what it does. It's my job to tell you what the facts are. We do know that there are many problems in reserve communities, again, primarily under the jurisdiction of the federal government. There's more than 100 high-priority contaminated sites in reserve communities in Ontario, and I'm not aware of the federal government doing very much about it.
The whole idea of turning a blind eye or ignoring it seems like it's a theme, not just with your chapters on the Indigenous communities, but also, you know, with the Algonquin wolf and the permitting programs. Is this is it a resource issue just generally in some of these ministries?
The Ministry of Environment and Climate Change really is working hard to improve its environmental justice behavior. Since we last reported on this 3 years ago, there has been a very noticeable improvement. Ministry of Natural Resources, I cannot tell you. I mean, I truly cannot come up with any rational explanation for why they are failing endangered species so completely, why they have absolutely no budget for protected areas, why they've ignored so many of the issues on aggregates, why they've stripped the Algonquin wolf for protection. I don't know. I hope you will ask the minister.
In terms of that permitting program, why have a permitting program if it won't reject any permit requests at all?
The Ministry of Natural Resources implementation of the Endangered Species Act is terrible. I mean, it's just dreadful at every level. One of the examples, there's usually no appeal from what they do, and there's very little public transparency, and they don't publish the information that people would need. So the only time in which their decisions get scrutiny is when it relates to a renewable energy project. And when the ministry's decisions are examined by the Environmental Review Tribunal for renewable energy projects, they're not very good quality. So one of the examples was the Blanding turtles at Ostrander Point. The ministry said, okay, no problem, we're going to allow the big issue at Ostrander Point was that turtles will be killed by traffic on the road. And you can't afford to lose mature turtles in those populations. They just disappear. So the ministry said, fine, there was an overall benefit to the species because there was other habitat created, but the turtles were going to have to cross the road to get there. I don't know whether they explained that to the turtles.
I just want to get back to that notion of it being a resource issue. I mean, we know that there are some really great people within the Ministry of the Environment who care deeply about these concerns. Is it just a matter of not having enough bodies to respond on the ground?
There are a lot of different parts of the story. One of the issues that we raise is the lack of adequate enforcement. And one of the reasons we heard from that was that it was difficult for the ministry to pinpoint the source of an emission when there are 57 facilities all around the reserve. And the ministry simply hasn't had enough monitoring equipment to tell where the sources are. So that is going to be approved under the benzene technical standard. As you know, each facility is going to have to put 6 monitors on its fence line. The ministry says they're buying more monitoring devices. I hope they will put more on the reserve. So resources are a piece of the story, but they don't explain the failure to update the standard since 1974. They don't explain the ignoring of flares, and they don't explain ignoring cumulative effects, which has been something that's been raised over and over, certainly for the last 10 years. Not just in Amjung, but other parts of the province.
You're not the first commissioner to highlight pollution in Amjadong as an area of concern. Are you optimistic that this time the people in power will heed your concerns?
Yes.
How come?
First of all, we've seen dramatic changes in the last couple of years, as I've already indicated. Secondly, the response that we got from the Ministry of the Environment about the work they are doing both on the air standards and on the resourcing for the Sarnia community, I think are really good signs. And I think that the community is now, with your series, they've got public attention, and I don't think they're going to allow themselves to be ignored, and I don't think they will be. Yes, sir.
Sure. In the section on algae, one of the promising things that you note is the amendments in July 2017 that allowed the provincial government to institute trading.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, just because it can doesn't mean it will. So are you aware of any developments in that, or specifically, would you have recommendations as to how to implement water trading of that sort?
We looked at this in our Every Drop Counts report as well, and certainly the South Nations Conservation Authority is a world leader on phosphorus training, and they have done a really good job. When I was down at the South Nations Conservation Authority earlier this year, they're required by law to get a 4-to-1 benefit for the phosphorus trading. Their calculations, they've achieved about a 20-to-1 benefit. And they've done it by putting control with the farmers. So it's not some government bureaucrat telling farmers what to do. It's farmers working with other farmers. And it's a farmer committee that decides who gets how much money, and it's farmers who check up on and help each other. And that sounds like a really good approach to me. I hope we see more of it. We've got 20 years of experience of it working. Why not build on that? Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm sorry the report's so thick, but it's really good.